Started then. Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Ready to Teach Week. I'm Gregory Winslet. I used to be Greg Winslet, but I've decided to rebrand. And I'm standing in for Professor Karen Benson, and we both work in the Institute of Teaching and Learning Innovation. And I'd like to start today, and indeed the week, with an acknowledgement to country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we're all meeting today. And on behalf of these traditional owners, I'd like to pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And we very much recognise their valuable contributions to Australia and global society and the University of Queensland. So now, I know that this can be a stressful and hectic time of the year. So I'm really thrilled to see all of you and so many of you, both now and probably during the recordings. So at the risk of infuriating some of you, this is actually my favourite time of the work year. It's my favourite time because now's the time where so often I or someone I know, someone in my network, has something new, has something interesting to engage with that they're planning to undertake. And this could be a new approach to assessment or a new activity with students. It could be a new resource or a new colleague or even a new subject to teach. And it's a very special time of that year because it does generate a lot of, I think, enthusiasm for novelty. So what I'm personally hoping to get out of the sessions in Ready to Teach, and I'm hoping that you do too, is a chance to share what your novel plans are and maybe get inspired by some of the conversations this week and definitely get inspired from the expert speakers today and during the week. It may also be a chance, I think, to reflect on anything novel, risky or fun that you may have introduced to your teaching last year. And, you know, I think it's also a great opportunity to perhaps reflect on and smile about some of the spectacular mistakes or surprises that maybe didn't feel so funny at the time. So that's what I hope for you all and for myself for this Ready to Teach week. But it also behooves me to quickly profile the Italy staff that have prepared and designed the session this year and in previous years. Look, I think at its simplest, Italy, the people in Italy are here to support teaching. We do this through a range of ways, not just events like this and of course Teaching and Learning Week. And we've been very busy trying to increase our value and commitment to supporting digital teaching practice through course design, through building alongside academic teachers, through e-learning workshops and consultation and support when things go a bit pear-shaped, as well as some of the innovations that we're focusing on in learning analytics and educational media and more. Our work is always connected as deeply as it can be to the scholarship of teaching and learning and our colleagues and researchers in the higher education academic community, our principal and affiliate practitioners, our HEA fellows and teaching innovation grant recipient community, and the list goes on. So it's very tricky to capture our services on one slide. Here I've got a note to laugh disarmingly. But if you remember nothing else, we're here to help, and feel free to reach out or trawl through the Italy website or connect with any of your colleagues who may have had work with us. So a key theme this week and in previous Ready to Teach events is that we're a community. We're a community of teaching practitioners. And what that means is that we ask for help, we give guidance, we challenge. And I think that's a really important one. We challenge and we support each other. And that all of those sorts of behaviours are at the heart of a healthy and productive teaching community. So for this reason, each session, including the one that's following now, it's an opportunity to connect, to collaborate and to consider individual practice. So it's an action-packed week, something for everyone. The session details are available on the Italy website, and I understand that there are still spots available, but I'd suggest that people get in quick because they can fill up. And also, I'm assuming that at least some of you are interested in the latest moral panic, which is ChatGPT 3. And there are some sessions that explicitly address this on Tuesday and Thursday. but the decision has been made to really focus on local faculty and support events. So I'd really encourage you to keep your eyes on those. And this won't be going away anytime soon. You'll be sick to death of the topic over the next little while. I'm sure I'm already close to it myself. So now to the main event. Jason Lodge and colleagues will be leading an interactive session to explore how the higher education learning framework can guide your thinking and practice about teaching and learning design and beyond. And as I understand it, there will be a specific focus on self-regulated learning, but of course it will be much broader than that as well. But you know, who's Jason Lodge? You know, why should we trust what he has to say? I turn now to ChatGPT-3. So this isn't looking good, is it? So let's see what happens when we put a prompt there. So I'm now starting to think I made a bit of a mistake in introducing this session and indeed coming to the session. And finally, this is a little bit better, but I get the sense that ChatGPT-3 is kind of humoring me now. So I dare say this is not the first and won't be the last extremely cheesy ChatGPT-3 reference that you're going to get during this week. And we've already talked about the limitations, and it'll be very exciting when the conversation pivots a little bit more about what we can actually do to leverage this in detail. So I'll close now and I'll leave it to Jason to introduce himself probably more seriously than I did and his colleagues. And I will note though that Jason's work and insights have been absolutely key to Italy over the past few years. So I'm really looking forward to this session. Thank you all for indulging my introduction. Bye now. Over to you.
Thank you, rebranded Gregory. Good morning, everybody. So you may or may not be pleased to know that I have not used artificial intelligence for any part of this workshop this morning. So let me just get set up here so that I can see everybody. Okay. Right. Okay. Good morning. Good to see you all here bright and early on a Monday morning. We are going to get stuck into this. We are going to talk about ChatGPT because it's kind of hard to avoid at the moment, but I think it does, the current moment that we're finding ourselves in does point to some important things that I think lead us into a discussion about fundamental aspects of learning. So I think it's important for us to touch on where we currently are, and we will do that as we go. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're collectively meeting today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Okay, so on this little adventure that we're going on this morning, I am not alone. I am joined by three very capable colleagues who I'm sure will contribute to the discussions that we're likely to have. If anybody's got anything that they would like to add to the discussion, feel free to use the chat. I've got it open, I can see it. Tanya's also going to keep an eye on it for anything that I might miss on the way through. Leaving aside the artificial intelligence introduction. So my name's Jason Lodge. I am one of the Deputy Associate Deans Academic in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm also based in the School of Education, and I'm the Principal Practitioner for Digital Learning in Italy. Joining me this morning, I've got Alex, Linda, and Rachel. Alex, could you go first and tell us about you, please?
Yeah, sure. So good morning, everybody. I'm Alex, sometimes branded as Alexandra. I'm a Senior Research Assistant with the Learning Lab at the School of Education, and I've been collaborating with Jason on the Higher Education Learning Framework 2.0. And I've also been working as a tutor with the School of Biomedical Sciences for the past 4 years.
Thanks, Alex. Linda.
Good morning, Linda MacDonald. I'm currently the manager of the Digital Learning Uplift program, which is part of the Italy initiative. And I'm here because Jason promised it would be good fun.
That's a hard promise to live up to, Linda. Thank you, Rachel. Rachel.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Fitzgerald. I'm the Deputy Associate Dean Academic at the Bell Faculty, and I'm also the Associate Director for Online Education in the Business School. I don't know why I'm here, but I'm sure I'll have some things to say.
That's why you're here.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you all. All right, so the way this is going to work is that we'll sort of step through this, the project that we've been working on. We'll do a little bit of kind of preamble up front to have a chat about where we currently are in terms of the chat GTP 3 or 4 or whatever we're going to be up to in the not too distant future. And then we'll have some time for some kind of questions and discussions as we go. Importantly, we want to touch on some of the things that we've learned from interviews with world-leading experts, particularly around digital and online learning, and some of the things that we can take from those interviews that might help us to think about the higher education learning framework, whether it needs to be updated, changed, amended, whether we need to think about things differently, and so on. So let's start where we currently find ourselves with the potential that robots are going to be doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things for our students, with our students, in spite of our students. Many of you are no doubt aware of the discussion that's been happening of late. If you've just come back from holidays, welcome. We have a new crisis that you might want to get your head around, apparently. So we have these new tools available, and there is a lot of discussion out there about whether or not this is a particular threat. So what we're talking about here is generative artificial intelligence. Put in a prompt, as Greg did earlier, and it will spit out an essay, a lesson plan, a screenplay, all sorts of different things. So there are text-based versions of this, there are music-based versions, there are image versions. The image that I presented there was a prompt that I put into one of these systems. Here is a robot doing a student's assignment late at night, the day before it's due. So, you know, you can get these sorts of things generated very easily now in multiple different ways. So with all of the discussion going on, one thing that I think we need to consider is, what are we really talking about here, and is this a threat to higher education? Rachel, what do you think? What's your sense of what's happening here at the moment before we get stuck into the meat here?
Okay, well, I mean, for me, I think generative AI has like a lot of potential. It can offer a whole range of benefits for higher education in terms of student engagement, collaboration, accessibility. But, you know, I think there are valid challenges and concerns in relation to academic honesty and plagiarism. And I think it can be difficult to kind of distinguish between the human and machine generated learning. But I think there's a lot of potential now. Basically, we're not going to be able to put it back in the box. I don't think what we need to do now is ignore it. I think we need to acknowledge it and be very open about how we're going to engage with it and how we expect our students to engage with it. And I think thinking about that idea of responsibility and kind of practice will actually inform how our graduates go in the future, because generative AI has impact everywhere, not just in higher education. So I'm excited about it, but you know, this year is going to be a learning curve, I think, for all of us.
And Linda, from your perspective, from the learning design side of the world, what are you seeing as some of the challenges here, particularly because we're seeing some quite strong reactions? You know, the Queensland government, for example, is banning the use of these tools in Queensland schools. What do you think about all of this?
Look, I'm inclined to agree with Rachel. I think there's lots of opportunities. I think it will be challenging for assessments, obviously, and people may have to rethink what they're doing in that area. But I also think that there are just so many things that people are already using it for. So I'm sitting in on design meetings at the moment with academics who are trying to word their learning objectives, and they're popping them into ChatGPT and using it productively, or even just to look at finding case studies that don't have bias, or thinking about, I had one academic recently who needs data sets that he then has students manipulate, and he normally has to trawl through, you know, endless numbers of articles to find something that's appropriate. He's just popped it in. He's actually now getting it to find the articles. So it could be a real time saver for academics and for learning designers, but I think we just have to be cautious with how we use it. And of course, the whole academic integrity issue is going to be huge for a while, I think. But I think trying to ban people using it, it's just another tool. We just have to work out how to use it.
Thank you. Yeah, really important points. So where we want to turn with this as we work our way back to the higher education learning framework is that I think obviously a lot of what we're talking about here is relatively new. These kinds of tools have been sort of sitting in the background for a while. However, it's really been sort of the last month or so that they've become widely available and people have really started to play with it, hence the sort of explosion of activity here. There have been some interesting responses to this, some of which are around this idea that we really need to think carefully about what it means to be a human as we start to see these tools increase more and more into the domains of work that we find ourselves in the domains of education, as we're talking about here. And I think that that's a sort of valid point. You know, as more kind of routine things are able to be done by these sorts of technologies, then we do need to ask fundamental questions about what it means to be human and how much we should be focusing on that. That's one part of this, I think. Another part for me is that when we think about what we do here at the university, what we do in a higher education context, there is always this kind of tension between the outputs of learning or performance and the actual process that our students go through to get there. And the argument that I've made in a couple of places now is that I think we have tended to lean far too much towards the kind of performance output piece. So most of the time we're talking about learning outcomes, we're talking about various forms of assessment, which are often the production of an artifact. The artifact is marked, not the process. So it's some sort of kind of outcome, output, some sort of representation of performance, whether that be an exam script or a lab report or whatever the case may be. Now, we do that for a lot of different reasons. One is because it's extremely difficult to see what happens with learning over time. There have been people who have been talking about some ways of doing this. Valerie Shute in the United States is one example of this. She's talked about this idea of trying to think about continuous assessment, where we're getting a sense of how students' thinking is developing over time, but that's going to be incredibly resource intensive, incredibly difficult. So there are good reasons why we tend to focus on outputs and performance rather than trying to understand learning over time. But I think when we look at the balance of it, perhaps we're partly being caught out in this moment when we're thinking about things like Chat GPT and other generative AI, and that they can just do the performance. They don't do the learning that arrives at that performance. They simulate that, right, by doing a bunch of predictions on what something should look like. And I think that that distinction is really important, and it probably suggests that maybe we need to kind of tip the scales back into balance, where we're thinking more about the process that students go to arrive at those outcomes and not just the outcomes themselves. I think it's inherent in what we all tend to do, but the very system that we exist within is so focused on these outcomes. If you think all the way through to the Australian qualification framework, it's very outcome oriented. There's very little in there which suggests that we're thinking carefully about the process that students go through to arrive at that outcome. So it's really then trying to think more carefully about what the process of learning is. So to think about this another way, this is a model that I like to use to think about some of the issues that we deal with here. If you haven't seen this before, this is Peter Goodyear's work. It's a little older now, but I still like this as a way of making sense of what it is that we're doing. That middle square there is the stuff that we often spend our days trying to navigate, the learning environments that we're dealing with, the kind of organizational settings that we're managing. We come up with a series of tasks, learning activities, assessment tasks. Students then go off, do those. They do some of those with us in the same space, the same virtual space, the same physical space. And then hopefully they will end up meeting the sorts of learning outcomes that we're looking for. To me, I think this is kind of where the magic happens. And as somebody who has, a course with 150, or I'm looking at 160 or 170 students this semester, I have some idea in my mind when I'm coming up with assessment tasks, or I'm thinking about learning activities for students, about what that is going to mean for them and then how they might go about doing that. But of course, my 160, 170 students are going to do that in 160 or 170 different ways. And potentially none of those ways are going to be anything like what I had kind of thought that they were going to do with that activity or assessment task. So there's this kind of gap between the settings that we create in courses and the outcomes, and those are the bits that students have ultimate agency over, particularly as we start to increase flexibility. So there is an important element here, which I think means that we need to think very carefully about the processes that students are going through. One other way of kind of thinking about this is that we've got a goal that we're hoping our students will achieve. again, the system is set up around this, including the way that the Australian qualification framework is set up, where they're working towards a goal. But if that goal is a particular kind of artifact, whatever that may be, an assessment task that is a lab report or an essay, then there are now tools available that allow the goal to be achieved without necessarily going through these other components. So the more we can think about these processes, and the way that we've tried to tease this apart in the image that you see there, is that there are elements that are going on that are part of the task level. So what are students actually doing while they're trying to put an essay together or develop a lab report or whatever it might be? How are they making sense of their own progress, which is that kind of meta level where they're consistently making judgments about how they're progressing, and what happens in between those two layers. So one of those components in there is that they're monitoring how they're progressing. So this is a self-regulated learning piece that Greg referred to before. And they're also going through a set of decisions on the basis of those judgments and how they're monitoring their progress. Machines don't do any of that. So I think that when we think about what we're potentially looking at and the way that we might need to think about assessment going forward when we've got these new technologies available, is that the more we can start to emphasize some of these processes that are going on along the way, the more ability we've got to be able to actually get a sense of the processes that students are going through. And we're not going to see as much of that kind of shortcutting straight to the goal without going through that, the necessary learning to get there. So I've tried, as no doubt a lot of people have, putting my assessment tasks through ChatGPT as an example. Now, I've got education students. They're going to be future teachers in Queensland, the majority of them. Part of what they need to do is be able to come up with good lesson plans. ChatGPT can do that all day long, no problem at all. And it does a pretty good job of contextualized lesson plans for example, senior secondary psychology in Queensland. So it in terms of the output, does a great job. But part of that assessment task for my students is also for them to explain the kinds of decisions that they've made to arrive at that lesson plan. Now, ChatGPT, again, will give some indication of a broad justification of a lesson plan, but not the lesson plan that is important for the context that the students need to think about. So there's a disconnect there between the kind of artifact, the lesson plan, and the sorts of decisions that went into the way that that lesson plan is represented. So putting those two things together means that I'm then capturing some of that process in addition to the output. Now, that's not to say that these technologies won't get better at simulating that stuff, but for the time being, I think there's a clear separation there. So it again sort of reinforced to me the importance of the process, the monitoring that students are going through, the way that they're making decisions that allow them to arrive at a kind of artifact. And, again, goes back to why processes are important in all of this. So why do we think a higher education learning framework might help here? I've done enough talking up until this point. Why do we need something like this? Happy for people to put stuff in the chat. Rachel, Linda, Alex, happy for you to jump in here. Do we need something like this? Isn't it going to be different for all of our students? Rachel?
Well, Jason, I'm just going to share about the work that's been going on in the business school for online learning, because I think it kind of fits in very well with your frameworks there. But it's about understanding that process of learning. And I think the lessons learned from the way we approach design for online is actually something that can easily translate into the classroom. And I'm really glad to see Carrie's here, because her team has done some fantastic work improving processes in order to help this work. But the way we start is we do have a very clear online learning pedagogy, a higher level approach to how students learn. And a lot of it is built around Redmond's framework, the online learning framework. So it's about, like developing social engagement with the students, it's about emotional engagement, it's looking for collaborative opportunities, about, developing that kind of social skills, but also about that feeling of belonging before we even think about how they're learning. But the process then of approaching how the learning is designed actually really is tied into constructive alignments. That means that we're very much focused around the activities that the students do and not about the content, right? The content is not as important as what the students are actually doing. So we know what outcomes we'd like them to achieve. We know kind of how we'd like to assess those outcomes, and we think creatively about it, because we've actually brought in a process which is built upon Salmon's Carpe Diem model, which is about design. It's actually an early form of design thinking for curriculum. So it brings in everybody. It's not just the teaching team or the course coordinator. It's also the learning designers, occasionally librarians, sometimes, and they bring in students, sometimes brings in industry. So everybody has a voice in the design of how this actual course is going to happen. So obviously the assessment becomes a lot more creative because of that. But then because we're looking at it from that constructive alignment point of view, it means that and with a bit of backward design, we're thinking really consciously about what are the students doing in order to help them be able to do those assessments. And those activities, I think, brings around a much deeper engagement with learning. And actually, it gives the students a lot more time to kind of reflect on what they're doing, but also lets the course coordinator reflect on what's happening and how that works. Now, originally, when we started this process, I was very much, old school, post-its, etc. The learning team have brought that into like a Miro poster board, which means that there's a storyboard for these courses. So everybody can see the kind of activities that are designed, and they're color coded to show like when it's a reading activity or when it's actually, like some kind of engagement activity, a group activity. And so every single thing is purposeful, every single thing that's been put into those courses. And I think that ties very much into what you were talking about there. And before we go into the learning framework, again, this is based on an online learning framework, but it is highly structured, but it does give a real purpose to everything that's involved in there. And like that's the kind of thing I think will really, it makes a huge difference to whether or not you can bring in something to automate your assessments. It's not going to work when you're actually asking the students to really deeply engage all the way through, and you're engaged with them and you know what they're thinking about, what's coming up. Everything they do is relevant to whatever assignment they've got to produce. So this is, again, something I think that we should really start turning back around and talking about that kind of design process for our courses, and thinking much more about that learning activity work, whether it's in class or whether it is online, both work.
Thank you. Yeah, agreed on all fronts, Rachel. Linda, did you want to add anything there?
No, look, I think it's exactly right. Taking those approaches, we do slightly different approaches to what Rachel is describing, but certainly sitting down, thinking about constructive alignment, of course. We use different models. Some people have used Carpe Diem, I know. We've sometimes used Diana Laurielard's models of looking at different types of learning tasks and how they fit together. But overall, I guess what our team are really looking at, we're looking at someone's course holistically. What are you doing face-to-face? What are you doing on learning? What are you doing in assessment? And then trying to make it an integrated experience for students. So ultimately looking at what they're going to be doing week by week in that time frame. So yeah, totally agree with what Rachel said. There's many ways to skin a cat. There's lots of ways of looking at design, but I think ultimately it's a matter of collaborating with the academic and working through, because of course there are constraints. You have to not only just be thinking about what would make an amazing course, but what is actually achievable.
Great, thank you. And good to see some comments in there. Thanks, Dom. Yep. Well, we would hope it would be incredibly helpful. All right, let's get into it. Now, many of you will be familiar with this story, so I won't labour the point at this stage. So we did develop the original higher education learning framework a few years ago. Now, what we were tasked to do, this was part of the Science of Learning Research Centre, which was an ARC-funded national centre, was to think about what do we understand about what high quality learning looks like in the higher education learning context, and what are the things that we really should be emphasising and focusing on, what really matters. And in order to do that, we identified quite a long list of the leading thinkers in this area globally, and asked them if they would be willing to do an interview with us. So there were 24 in the end, in the original version of this. So there was a lot of data there that we filtered through, and we essentially landed on these 7 principles that you'll see there. Again, so Linda's put the link in there for you, so you can go and have a look at this later on. So I won't sort of spend a lot of time on this. We're going to come back to these though and ask the question about whether or not the same principles are the sorts of things that we need to think about when we add digital technologies or online learning into the mix. Is it a different set of principles that we need to come up with, or do we need to think more carefully about how these might play out in different ways? I think most of them are relatively self-explanatory. Some of them I think are a little bit more complex than others. Learning is becoming, for example, has a much more of a kind of, well, I guess, an ontological component to it, that students are not just learning, they're sort of becoming professionals, becoming graduate scientists, whatever it is that they're doing through the university journey. So there's a little bit in there for us to think about. So that's our original version of the HELF. And where we've sort of thought about this relative to the model that I spoke about before, Peter Goodyear's model, is that I think it provides this sort of foundation for thinking about what learning processes need to look like, what high quality learning processes need to look like. Now, we didn't just talk to the kind of 24 of the experts that we identified. We also drew heavily on the literature and the way that we understand how learning works. So, there's a long history of stuff out there that also fed into this. I think that's important. The last time I spoke about this, I didn't mention that. It's just like, oh, you spoke to a bunch of experts. Well, that's part of it. But part of it is also to look at the long history of research in this area as well. So in our mind, this helps to provide that foundation, which then kind of flows down into the other elements of what we do. So the way that Peter described this is kind of like a philosophy, right? How does learning work? What does that mean for students in my area? And then on the basis of that, what kind of decisions do I make in terms of how I go about my overall approach to teaching and setting courses up? And then what kinds of strategies and tactics will we use underneath that? So the important thing here is that there's some sort of alignment within this framework that is founded on these kinds of solid principles that we can look at and say, well, okay, we can agree that these are pretty important things that we really need to emphasize. Here's where the spanner got thrown in the works. So no doubt all of you have seen this sort of discussion over the last few years, that the sorts of things that we experienced during the pandemic across all education sectors, not just higher education, have somehow changed the way that we think about education forever, right? And there's thousands of articles out there about this. As a journal editor, I probably see several a week minimum, where people are still trying to tell us this story. I guess there are some debatable elements of this, but there are still certainly some perceptions of the way that online learning works, including things that have happened in the last week, that would suggest that some people see online learning in particular and other components that are related to digitally facilitated learning as inferior. So the Chinese government is saying that all students who are studying at foreign universities need to be on campus. The implication here, of course, is that there is somehow something inferior about the online learning that they were getting in their own country, that it's not the same, that there is something fundamentally not working about it. It's an interesting perspective. Not sure that's true, but we'll dig into that a little bit more as we go. So the question then is really, what can we take from the experiences that have happened over the last few years? Do we need to fundamentally rethink what online or digital learning mean as a result of what we've seen over the last few years? So we're taking a little bit of a sidestep away from talking about ChatGPT. We're trying to think about what we have seen over the last few years and whether or not that means we need to go back and rethink what we have as a set of principles that are in the higher education learning framework. Linda, what do you think? Do we need to go back to the drawing board?
I don't think you do, no. We use the higher education learning framework during our design sessions to inform how things should be designed. I think they're just overarching principles that can be adapted to online. I don't see it as anything that needs to be thrown out, that's for sure. They're core principles. Learning should be contextualized face-to-face and online. It's just, I don't see it as an issue, quite honestly, Jason. I think they can be adapted. I think there's a slightly different emphasis you might put on things when you're doing them online, but quite honestly, when you say is online inferior, I think it's such a complex question, right? Because in some instances, online can be superior. But sometimes it is inferior. It just really depends on so many things. It depends on the students, it depends on what they're trying to learn about. There are so many things that feed into that. It's not an easy end. And in fact, when we're designing our digital learning course, redesigning courses, we're commonly in the design phase thinking about what belongs online, what belongs face-to-face. We're not looking at pushing everything online. We're looking at trying to come up with the best possible design based on what students need. So in some courses, that's a lot online, and in some courses, it's very little.
Yeah. Rachel, did you want to add anything?
I was just I like to build on what Linda's just said there as well. Is I think the word seems to have been forgotten since COVID came in, but we were very much about blended learning pre-COVID, and it was very much a balance of what do you do online and what do you do face-to-face, and that was actually what an internal student experience was. So it doesn't matter if the Chinese government says online is inferior, the blended learning approach is not gone away. This is actually how we are designing for our learning. Now, fully external is a little bit different. So that is a fully online course, but there's not many of them. We don't do a huge range of fully online courses, programs. We do, I mean, obviously, I'm very much involved in those that are fully online. And I do think there's lessons to be learned. I think the other way around, I think when you design for fully online, it actually can much better inform the design of a blended internal experience. And so I just think we just need to remember like that the lessons learned perhaps from COVID, if anything, is actually how to use the tools more effectively to maybe engage students, to kind of keep track of them, to maybe start bringing in some analytics. The little bits and pieces of that technology that's been helping us in COVID is actually being lessons learned, right? This is great. We now have so many more tools that we can do this work with students, but our mode of teaching is internal, but it's blended. So digital is still there, it hasn't gone away. And I just think somehow in the conversation that seems to be like, there seems to be very much a divide between online and in the classroom. There's not, it's coming back to where we were before COVID hit.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Yeah, really important point.
And I think there can be a vast difference between someone designing something to be great online versus just shoving stuff online. So, you know, I think that's what some of what had happened in COVID was a bit of a travesty. So people were calling all sorts of things online learning, whereas it was not that good an experience for students, obviously.
Yeah, I heard somebody explain it as the kind of life raft version of online learning. Whereas, you know, if it's done properly and planned properly and designed properly, it looks much more like a luxury liner, and comparing the two of them doesn't really make a lot of sense. Yep. Nice. Yes, important point, Erin, just looking at the chat here. What we need to understand what works in each mode. You're a few slides ahead of us here. Face-to-face learning is 100% what do we consider online learning. And I think that, Rachel, you picked up on this point that the modes are starting to blend so much now that it almost doesn't make sense for us to talk about it in this really bimodal manner. It's either, you know, on campus and face-to-face or completely online and external, because we're seeing so much more of a mix of things going on, particularly if you think about sort of online students who are also distant from the university. Well, now there's options like the country university centres where they may not be anywhere near a campus, but they're getting a kind of live interactive face-to-face experience, despite the fact that they're some distance away from a campus. So even if you think about what we had traditionally thought about as an external or a distant student, if you like, those situations are also now starting to become a lot more grey. It's not just online or just on campus. There's such a nuanced mix of things there. So in terms of your question there, Armando, I think it's kind of hard to say, because we're seeing a whole lot of a range of different modalities emerging. You know, then we've got hybrid, you know, where you've got students in the room and students online potentially interacting at the same time. So there's a whole range of stuff going on there. Dom, are the experiences of COVID more about shocks and change than online digital? I think that's probably fair. And there's also a lot of innovation that occurred during that time. Yeah. Yeah, Erin, good point. I am going to come back to that, Erin, the challenges of trying to do some of these things. Absolutely. Okay. No surprises as far as the university strategy goes, and I don't think this should be a surprise to anybody that we are going down the path of thinking about more, at least, you know, digital learning, more online learning, and we need to think carefully about the sorts of things that we're then going to need to do as a result of that. So we've got a number of these things coming together, the experiences of the pandemic, thinking about where we're headed into the future over the next 10 years in terms of the university strategy. We did want to kind of ask the question about whether or not we had the right foundations within the higher education learning framework for that potential future that we're headed towards. So do we need a different HELF for digital learning? And we've already heard some really good points of view, Linda and Rachel contributing to this. We wanted to try and also think about how we might extend on the work that we did previously to go back to some experts and say, well, what do they kind of think about this, to sort of draw on those opinions out there as well. So I'm going to hand over to Alex in a second, who's been leading the actual data collection around all of this and doing the analysis of it. But importantly, we wanted to make sure that when we thought about what this brave new world might look for us as, you know, an institution that is traditionally campus-based, we aligned some of this with some work that we did for the federal government. There was some understandably concerned people thinking about the experiences of the pandemic and what they meant for the National Higher Education Standards Framework. So Kelly Matthews, myself, Melissa Johnson, Matthias Kubler from ISSR, we won a tender to look into this. And this was work that was going on alongside of what we're going to talk about in terms of the updated higher education learning framework. Essentially, the standards are pretty good as they are. They're robust to these changes in modality, which is good. But the one thing that we did point to as part of this work is exactly what we've just addressed. And that is that when we think about what modes look like, it's not just this bimodal situation where it's one or the other. There are more kind of blends of these things, and we need to be mindful of that as we go forward. So that was one piece of work that informed where we were going with this. Another important one, I always tend to go back to Martin Weller's work on this as a reminder of where we've been. Many of you in here may have seen the commentary over the last couple of years that sort of sounded a bit like online learning was invented in 2019. Martin's work is great as a reminder that, you know, people have been serious about this stuff for 25 years or more now. And there have been a whole lot of things that have emerged over that time. If you haven't seen Martin's work before, it really does help provide that perspective. And then you can potentially go back further than that and think about the way that we were doing distance learning prior to that. So it's not as though a lot of the ideas and concepts and practices that we're thinking about here emerged in 2019. There is, you know, a solid several decades worth of solid, rigorous work on trying to figure out how to do this well that we have behind it. So again, it's not as though we just went out to a bunch of experts and said, well, what do you think about this? We were really mindful of bringing that longer term context to bear on trying to think about what an updated or enhanced or HELF 2.0 might look like. So again, multiple pieces in this. And then we went back out to our group and, well, we had a new group that we identified as people who were particularly expert in the kind of technology piece related to higher education. And I'll hand over to you, Alex, to tell us a little bit more about the process that we went through there.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. So as Jason said, we reached out to experts in online learning in higher education and conducted interviews to understand what online learning is good for, why it can be different to learning online versus face-to-face, what their thoughts about online versus face-to-face were, and just discussing online learning in general. And what we found after conducting the inductive thematic analysis was a few common themes that have come up. So this is preliminary data, so I'm just going to introduce what these emerging themes are. And please take notes and reflect as you go and let us know if there's anything that sounds really familiar and anything that's really new, and then we'll discuss it afterwards. So one of the main emerging themes was around learning design, designing for online, and that idea of constructive alignment. The idea of a sense of belonging came up as well. So the idea of establishing social connectedness, building a sense of community, actively through relationships between the educator and the student, but also between all of the student peers. engagement came up a lot as well. So in 2 different spheres, so engagement in terms of interaction and social connection, as well as engagement on a cognitive, emotional and behavioral level. Supporting change as a contextual element came up a lot. So the idea that learning is larger than the classroom and it's larger than the academic on their own, designing all the lesson plans. And that's something we've discussed earlier in this workshop as well. So that idea of collaborating with your peers, working with learning designers, the library, making it bigger than just the academic and that classroom. Emotions and the role that emotions play in learning came up a lot as well. And the idea that the way that that's supported is different with online learning versus face-to-face. Self-regulated learning was mentioned a lot, with the ideas that if you are designing for online in a way that has more independence than you may have traditionally designed, then that's going to push the students to need to have those self-regulated learning self-regulated learning skills, and personalization and flexibility. So giving your students more ways that they can be flexible around their learning, but also personalizing the assessment and the opportunities for students to learn and work around their own timetables and around all of their own commitments.
Thanks, Alex. Any surprises there for anybody? Not really. Anything missing? Again, feel free to use the comments if anybody wants to put anything in there. Rachel?
No, I think this is a really good summary, which kind of ties into probably quite a few of the frameworks now, which is really thinking about, again, the processes. Everything is in there. If you kind of think about, looking for student autonomy and help, you've got all that under self-regulated learning and the kind of helping students to learn. There's a whole range of things that we can break these down into. But I think coming back to the process of that design, it's hard, I think, for a lot of people to look at this list and go, okay, so how will I make sure this happens? How does this magically happen in what I teach? And I think that's probably the step back that we need to start looking at, is like, okay, so there are ways of approaching, course design, about, designing, like thinking about how we want to approach this, this kind of involvement of students, regardless of the mode of teaching, and thinking about who needs to be involved in that process, because, one person alone that's a hard job, right? There's a lot of things to try and do there. So it shouldn't be down to just one person. And I think that's the kind of, what we need to be looking for is a new way of approaching how we design what we teach and what students engage with.
Thanks, Rachel. I think, so one of the things for me, and this is one of the things that we've always been a bit challenged with in terms of this project, and this goes for the first version as well as this version, is separating out what are the things that we take as fundamental principles and how do those then tip over into something that becomes something that we can use in practice. And again, that's why I quite like Peter Goodyear's framework, because we can keep very focused on, these are the set of principles that we're going to accept, that these are the things that we value about the way that students learn. We have those as our foundation, and then we can start to think about how does that inform a set of decisions about what we might do with our high level approach and what kinds of strategies and tactics we might put in place. But it's a difficult transition point because there's no kind of hard cut between the two of them, I don't think. The principles might be informing what we're doing in practice, but there's always going to be this kind of ebb and flow in the way that those decisions are going to be made and how complex the situation is that we're dealing with. Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Linda, did you want to?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking it'd be nice to talk a bit more about the sense of belonging, because I think that can get lost online. I mean, it's hard sometimes you need to set that up carefully, I think, for students to feel welcome. And I guess when we're looking at our courses, we rely almost on the face-to-face sessions to do that. So when something's fully online, I think that can be, I'm not sure, extra hard. I mean, you'd have very fruitful discussions and you can have collaborative activities, but I think students can sometimes feel like they don't exist.
Yeah, that's on the next slide.
Oh, okay.
We're about to get to that one, Linda. Yeah.
Okay. And I also wonder about digital literacies and things. How does that fit into maybe this? Is that? I'm sure
That's one that we also grappled with. Isn't Alex? Did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, well, in terms of how much it came up in the data, it didn't come up a lot compared to the themes that I mentioned on the slide here. It was mentioned in terms of accessibility and equity, and making sure that each student has the same opportunity. But the main focus really shifted towards these themes that we see on the screen.
Yep. So we talked a little bit about what are some of the kind of fundamental things that we need to have in place that are not necessarily principles of learning per se, but are really important considerations that run in parallel to that. Digital literacy being one of them. You know, the quality of the kind of access that students might have that is kind of a separate issue that runs alongside the sort of digital literacy piece. Do I have sufficient access to the internet, for example, wherever I might be? And is that going to be a challenge for me to be able to get the same experience out of a course as I might otherwise have had? So there are some important fundamentals that we think run alongside this, but are not necessarily principles of learning per se. And I think part of what we found in this sort of preliminary carve through the data is that some of these components, for example, the supporting change piece, again, doesn't necessarily relate directly to student learning per se, but is a critical thing that we need to think about in terms of the way that we organisationally think about what the shift to a more kind of digital world looks like. And the same largely goes for learning design. So this is not a new thing in this version either. In the first version of the HELF, we did get pretty much all of the interviewees emphasise the importance of learning design as part of the kind of translation process of taking these principles and thinking about how they apply in practice. So it was good also again to see that reinforced in this version. One thing that we did want to do, so Armando, I just want to pick up on your point there, the challenge of difficulty one. There were kind of echoes of that in there, Alex, weren't there? But they didn't fall out as neatly, I don't think, as in the first version. But I think that it is inherent in some aspects of the way that we think about flexibility and how we manage self-regulated learning. So the first version, if you remember, was more about kind of this idea of learning how to learn, whereas self-regulated learning, I think, is a little bit more encompassing in terms of what do students do if they get challenged. Do they go and seek help? Do they know how to cope with that? Do they try different learning strategies? So it's a little bit more of an umbrella term rather than the kind of learning how to learn that we had in the previous version. So it's my sense is it's still in there. It's just represented in a slightly different way. Do you think that's fair, Alex?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And again, like we had limited time to talk to all of our experts. So I think the main focus from their perspective to get information across to us was really focusing on ideas of sense of belonging and how engagement is different online and how learning design looks different. So some did mention the learning difficulty and challenge, and there's an effort in learning, but I think because these ideas of the sense of belonging were a lot bigger than that, and the ideas of effort kind of fell on the wayside a little bit.
And I think that there's a nice, we pulled out Alex pulled out a couple of nice quotes. I think I'm breaking my own rule in terms of how many words I have on a slide here, but I think it was important to kind of give you a sense of some of the things that people were saying. So I'll give you a second just to read through that. I should also mention that because of the ethics that we have, we can't tell you who these people are that we interviewed. But for anybody who's been in this space for any time, you would know who these people are. So yeah, it was interesting to see their responses, that's for sure, knowing some of these people myself. But it's so there's a kind of a few interesting ideas here that I think start to separate out some of the important ways that we might think about what learning does look like across modes. One idea that was kicked around a lot, particularly early on in the pandemic, and I think has come up a couple of times here, is that we're always going to struggle against this idea that we're used to being in physical spaces together. There's something familiar about it. It's the way that we've all lived our entire lives. And that familiarity of that situation doesn't carry over particularly well to the online environment. So we need to think about different ways of getting that same kind of belonging happening. And there's lots of different ways that we might do that. And that's a point that I'll come back to in a second. But that was something that I think there was a little bit of a flavour of. What that means in terms of principles, of course, is a separate question that we'll circle back on in a second. Here's another quote. And I think to kind of sum this up, and this was Alex who came up with this, of course, stealing this from her, but credit to you, Alex, for picking this up. There was a theme across almost all of them, I think, that, right? So there's this interesting kind of, I think, tension here between thinking about modes of learning in different ways, but also considering what is common across all of them. What's your sense of that, Alex? I mean, you've been deeper into this data than any of us, so.
Yeah, so while there are different ways that you can apply these principles to specific contexts and different modes, it always came back to that idea that learning is learning. It's a process, and that process is going to look different in different contexts, in different disciplines, and with a different mode and different technologies and tools that you use. But that core idea of what learning is and the principles around that are the same.
Thank you. Great. So, returning back to our question, does the HELF need to be updated? I've tried to sort of pass this out in a couple of different ways. So there's our original version, as we touched on before. And then based on what we've seen from the discussions that have happened over the last couple of years and what our experts are telling us through the interviews, there's nothing in here I don't think that is impossible online. But none of these things, I think, because they are core fundamental principles about how students learn, are inherently not possible in a different kind of mode or in blended modes. What I think does start to play out in different ways is how difficult it might be for us to do so, right? So again, this is the separation of the kind of principles which the HELF represents and how we might go about applying those principles. And I've done my best guess of thinking about whether these are low, medium or high levels of difficulty. And you could potentially suggest that I'm way off on some of these, but this is sort of my sense about where I think some of the problems might lie. So, for example, if we think about something like the becoming piece, that could be potentially quite difficult. I think about my own students. You know, if you're going to be a future classroom teacher, it does become a little bit trickier to get a sense of the sorts of things that you might want to do as a classroom teacher if you're not in a classroom. In other contexts, that might be entirely different, right? The kind of simulated or a virtual environment might work much more effectively for that. In other cases, you can contextualize things for students relatively easily in an online environment. So the point here is that one side of this is these principles, they seem to line up relatively well. Our expert group seems to be coming back to similar sorts of ideas as we touched on in the first one. There are some slight differences in emphasis. As Alex mentioned, the sense of belonging came up quite a bit. It wasn't something that we had an overemphasis of in the first one, but really the devil's in the detail, I think, in that, it's great to have these principles in place. how do we then go ahead and apply those? Rachel, Linda, do you like our data? This is hot off the press. Neither of them have seen it before, so to be fair, this is brand new.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first quote that you threw up there, where it's like, you know, don't do online learning. I mean, I'm a huge advocate for fully online. I think when done well, it can be amazing. And I have evidence of current courses where, you know, the sense of belonging and the community that's created is working well, and it's really effective. And we've got alumni coming in to support new students, and they're continuing that community. So it can be done incredibly well. And, you know, again, you throw back some of the things you were talking about in the past about, you know, Australia used to lead on distance learning, right? So that all the methods and methodologies of how that happened was actually used to inform distance learning practice going back 10 years or so. But what you've come up with here, I think, is the principles are great. I wouldn't worry too much about the difficulty. I think it's all about the design. I do think, though, that it's the blend is going to be more important. Most people are involved in, you know, a little bit of both, face-to-face and online at the same time. And that's the tricky one, right? It's making sure that you understand how does that work together. And then it's really about kind of working with the right people in order to make sure that it happens. I think the categories that you go, and you know, the sense of belonging is important. The reason why it's coming up so importantly now is post-COVID, right? When we realized how important community is, when we realized that we actually do need to talk to each other. And when you're studying online, suddenly how important it is that you actually talk to people and understand what's going on. That's why it's really important now. And I think it's important that we keep that at the top of the list. So yes, I would make sure that's embedded into the new look framework too. But yeah, I think, you know, these are great principles to have. I think having the framework is very important. And I think, again, if we can start raising this as an institutional thing to look at, it would be brilliant.
Thanks, Rachel. Linda, Alex?
I can't really add anything more, Jason. I guess my only other comment might be just about maybe if you're looking at applying the principles to online learning as such, is defining that. So making sure that everyone is on the same page with respect to what online learning is, because I've talked to many academics. Some of them see a Zoom lecture as online learning. Some see that as a face-to-face at distance. So there's a little bit of clarification maybe. I mean, I don't see it as online learning, but it sort of is.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do people think?
Point. Well, there's almost two, really, isn't there? And in my mind, I've always separated out the synchronous from the asynchronous.
Yeah, that's the other way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's still, the words are bandied around and then not everybody's talking the same language, I guess. So it's good to make sure we're all on the same page with that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Linda. That's something that came up in our interviews as well, is that everyone has a different definition of online learning. That the idea that it's important to make a distinction between online learning and what online teaching is, recognizing that everybody has a different idea in mind when these terms come up. But even in the literature, there's no real consensus. So I agree. It's very important that we all get on the same page with the terminology and the definitions.
Yeah, that's a great question, Rebecca. And Alex has raised that one as well there. Alex, anything that you'd like to add to this based on your reading of it?
No, I think we've covered it all after what you, Linda, and Rachel have said. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's kind of sum that bit up and let's start talking about, okay, what can we do with all of this? So the way, in my mind, I think looking across all of the data that we've collected from our expert group and where the literature currently is in terms of thinking about this, we've got a handful of concepts or a handful of principles here that I think provide us a little bit of a foundation for thinking about what's important. But then how we apply those, as we've already kind of alluded to here, will vary across a number of different dimensions. So it's really thinking about how we make a set of decisions that will be represented in activities, assessment tasks, and whatever the case may be underneath all of this. So where this then goes in my mind is that if we've got these foundations that are provided by the health, then what do we actually do? What is our overall approach that we might take on here? Thankfully, we've sort of reached the point in the response to the pandemic where people have started to publish some really good thinking around some of this. So they've done a lot of the work for us. One of the ones that I was particularly struck with was this paper where they've provided these kind of pillars of online teaching. So you can see here that the emphasis is shifting. And this comes back to Alex's point before and your question here, Rebecca, where do principles of learning tip over into the way in which we think about how we teach, right? And I think this is a really good paper for capturing this, and I'll give you the greatest hits of it. Essentially, they have these 5 pillars. So we've got this foundation, what do we do with this? And these are the 5 things that, again, they've drawn on a huge body of research out there. And it says that these things are the critical things that you need to start thinking about in terms of what we do relative to how the students are learning. So you can see there, it's about relationships and community. So there's your sense of belonging. It's about active learning, which is no surprise because that's been something that we've been thinking about as a fundamental back to when we were much more focused on blended learning. To your point earlier, Rachel, thinking about blended learning before the pandemic. We need to think about learner agency. And what we really mean by that is allowing them to make decisions and being mindful, as I alluded to earlier, that when we set a learning activity or we set an assessment task, they're going to make a whole lot of decisions about how they're going to do that. We may have no insight into what those look like at all. So we need to help them to be able to make those good decisions and have that agency to do that well. We want to think about mastery. So it's not just about kind of rote learning, but actually becoming, as it alludes to there, masters of whatever the kind of discipline area or course might be, and wherever possible, try and personalize that, again, across a number of different dimensions. So there's probably not really any surprises here either. Thoughts on that? Rachel, Linda, do these make sense? Have we missed anything here? I think that this is a really good list.
I agree.
Okay, so
Sorry,
Sorry.
I'm very
Thank
happy
you.
with them. They
Yeah,
make a lot of
Right.
sense.
that makes sense.
okay, good. I would have been nice to have some constructive disagreement on some things, but I look at these and I tend to agree. It's sort of one of those papers where it was like, I wish I had have written this. It just clarifies the situation that we're in so well and really says these are the things from our side that we probably need to be focusing on in order to try and get the most out of, in their instance, they were talking about online learning. But when you look at each of these, I think that they would apply across any mode, in my mind. So importantly, then, I think we've got principles of learning and we've got some high-level things that give us some idea about what we should potentially be focusing on from the teaching side. Then we can start to think about what it might look like in terms of the sorts of strategies that we employ and the tactics. And strategies are things like what kinds of tools are we going to use? How are we going to set those up? Are we going to ask students to do a blog or create their own video? Are we going to run a webinar? Those sorts of things. And that's really a set of decisions that's going to come down to a particular context. And this is really where learning design, in my mind, comes to the fore. So we've got these foundations in terms of how do we understand how our students are learning? Here are the important things that we need to think about from the teaching side. What do we then do is the next layer down below that. In my mind, there's no real formula for this because it's going to be for each individual course and each individual situation, really a set of decisions that need to be made locally. And that's probably a good thing because if there was a recipe or a formula for all of this, then we'd all get replaced by artificial intelligence. So, there's that side of it. I'm just mindful of time, and we wanted to leave a little bit of time left at the end for some discussion or some questions, if anybody's got any questions. The last layer in all of this, and if you remember, I said earlier that we would hope that there is some alignment between, overall how we're understanding our student learning and what's important there, what's important for us in terms of the way that we teach, the kinds of decisions that are represented in things like a course profile. But then lastly, the tactics level refers to what do we need to do to make these things work? So it's all well and good to say I'm going to run a webinar and schedule that, but what do I need to be able to do to make that work effectively? And that's where I think there are some really kind of tricky things that we need to think about differently at this level than we may have otherwise needed to do. On one side of this, there are a whole lot of principles out there, multimedia learning principles, which I think help give us some sense of this. Many of you might be familiar with these. You know, these are the things that we need to try and make sure that we're doing, one of which I'm breaking right now, which is that there shouldn't be a whole lot of text on a screen while somebody's talking because the two of them get mixed up. But there are a whole lot of other sides in terms of the tactics component in this, which I think are a little tricky that we're still trying to understand. This is one paper that came out towards the end of last year, and essentially this was a systematic review looking at the way that we teach synchronously via Zoom, for example. And I think that for me, this made me feel a lot better about the fact that I struggled with this a bit when we, you know, I had quite large classes and we were trying to do this sort of thing that we're doing right now with those groups. It does require 24 clusters of different skills that are not the same as what you would need to have to manage a face-to-face class. So there is a level of unfamiliarity with the way that you need to run these sorts of things that we need to get up to speed on. So for anybody else out there who finds these sorts of things difficult, that's why, is that essentially it's a cluster, a whole lot of clusters of skills. Think about how you manage the chat, think about how you share the screen, think about how you set the thing up in the first place. All of these things are skills that are potentially foreign to us that we're not used to and are different to the sorts of things that we would do in a live classroom. So that, I think, is where some of the challenges come into this, is that there is a bit of a kind of art or craft, if you like, to doing this sort of webinar format well, that we're not necessarily used to. Hopefully we're all getting a little bit better at it, but it certainly made me feel a little bit better about how much I struggled with that early on. So that's kind of the tactics side of it, but hopefully you can see that the HELF and the updated version that might be slightly amended with some more discussion about belonging might help to provide some foundation for the way that we would attack this. But ultimately, there is a lot of complexity and there are many, many, many different ways that you might think about what a course would look like. There are many ways that we would think about how to run, you know, for example, video conferencing or webinar formats really well. And those are sets of decisions that probably really need to be made locally. And again, reinforce the importance of learning design in all of this. Okay, before we get to a little bit of time for some questions and comments, just to acknowledge Stephanie McMahon and Anne-Marie Carroll, who are also part of the team working on this component, this updated version. Neither of them could join us today, but we're all part of the UQ Learning Lab, headed by Anne-Marie, and the work was also supported by Italy. So just a shout out for everybody else who's been involved in this as well. Okay, let's have a chat about all of this. Thoughts, ideas, questions, comments, anything to add?
Jason, can I just clarify, that last paper you spoke about was just someone teaching synchronously online, not hybrid teaching even? No, okay.
Yeah, so do that in hybrid and add a whole lot of clusters
absolutely.
of skills on top of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
okay.
that's undoubtedly why we find it hard, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Feel free to jump in. Anybody, use the chat.
Very quiet out there.
People realise that they need more coffee for this.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, we just put it in the chat. This is what I have put is about the feedback from the students. I didn't see that in the learning design slide. Getting the feedback from the students.
Getting feedback from the students.
Yeah, that was not mentioned in the slide called learning design.
So just can I just clarify? So just ensuring that when you're looking at the course and the learning design of a course, you're making sure you seek that feedback. Is that?
Yeah, getting feedback from the students. You didn't mention. What I'm asking is whether it's not important in e-learning. not e-learning, digital learning, yeah.
I don't know if it needs, I suppose it's a case of it fits into all of the areas. But one of the things I'd say is really important. Student feedback is essential. And I'm not talking about that kind of summative DCAT approach. I think any kind of course design along this ways, it changes from cohort to cohort, but it's really important to kind of be continuously reflecting on the student's experience with the students and letting them have that agency to tell you what's working and what they're finding challenging. The really important part for us as teachers is that we are listening and adapting as we go to kind of take on board what's working, what doesn't, what's a challenge for people. And it's not just about the, okay, did you enjoy every aspect of the course? Did we teach you effectively, etc.? It's that ongoing kind of conversation, and it's about that getting to know your students, which I think ties into belonging. It ties into community. It ties into their the agency that you want to give students, that part of that learning to learn, but also that general behavioral engagement of that, that we're giving them kind of some control over what's happening and letting them have a voice in what's going on. So I would have thought, although it's not explicitly said as feedback, it is part of practically everything as part of that design.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I think. Yeah. Go ahead, Jason.
Oh, the only thing I was going to jump in and say is that I think every learning design model that I can think of has an evaluation piece within the kind of learning design process, and that evaluation always would include some element that is drawing on student feedback at some level. Would that be fair to say, Linda?
I totally agree. Yes.
Yep.
Wherever possible, understand who your customer is, I guess, is how we kind of look at it. Who's going to be using the course or whatever, and really understanding where they're coming from. Yep. It can be hard to get.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Amanda, jump. Go for it.
No, like what Rachel was saying is absolutely important. Like I blew through my first MBA accounting lecture time, and it was because I dedicated to just getting to know the students and just interacting with them. And I found that by doing that, they engaged a lot more. And in the first meeting, like it was the first lecture was difficult. They had, I told them, look, you're gonna be challenged here. I'm not gonna do the work with you. You guys have to do the work. You have to get on the bicycle and ride it, type of thing in accounting course. And there's students that hadn't used Excel. And so bringing them into it, I'm like, you have to get over those phobias. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. And I found that they told me later on they didn't like it. They didn't enjoy it the first few ones. But the fact that I got to know them and that I took in their concerns, one of the first questions I asked was, "How do you feel? How do you feel today?" Because it was like 7:30 on a Friday morning, and they engaged them, and I thought it was very powerful to do it that way.
Nice. What a great example of these principles being applied in practice. Fantastic. Thank you. All right, so we might wind up in a second just because that'll give you some time if you're going to any of the other sessions that are on today. Thank you all for coming along. I hope that was helpful. And there are plenty of resources on the Italy website. If there's anything about the HELF that you'd like to know more of, or you'd like for us to come out and talk to any group locally within your school or faculty, please let us know. We're happy to do that. That was part of the deal, is that we wanted to be able to try and get this out and see people use this work. So I hope you enjoy the rest of Ready to Teach Week. Thank you to my amazing colleagues on the panel that we've had this morning, and have a good day, everybody. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.